I have to say I start my first year lectures by saying I'm a geneticist and my job is to make sex boring. So I hope by the end of this lecture you will agree with me. And in fact, I'm going to talk about the escape from sex in this lecture, so maybe it'll end up being fascinating. Let me start by introducing you to your sixth cousin. Could you please shake the hand of the person to your left? Well, if you're both of European ancestry, mainly, that person is almost certainly, roughly speaking, your sixth cousin. So you share a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent in common. Okay? Even if you're of non-European origin from the Far East or have African ancestors, you wouldn't have to go much further back to find a common ancestor, because there have been plenty of Africans here in Britain for a long time, since the Middle Ages indeed, and the same is true for people from many other parts of the world. So we're all related to each other. In other words, when we choose a partner, we're choosing a relative, somebody with whom we share our genes because we descend from this famous common ancestor, either perhaps a grandparent, if you're cousins, or if it's just two random people chosen from this British street, a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent. Now, why is that inevitable? Many people think that there's something wrong with mating with a relative. Famously, Thomas Beecham said, "Try anything once except incest and folk dancing." Well, I've never gone in for folk dancing. And in fact, indeed, every married couple is in some senses committing incest. Why is that? It comes from that famous biblical event. Like most things in science, you can find relevance, particularly in the Old Testament, to it. Actually, this is in the Old Testament, the Apocalypse, Armageddon, here drawn here by William Blake, who used to, as you know, used to live up the road in Pentonville. Here, what was Armageddon? Armageddon actually, as we all know, the second will be marked in different ways, but whatever particular faith you yourself profess, of all the three religions of the book, it's a great gathering together of the peoples of the world at the end of time, the last judgment in Christian mythology, and it arises from a real historical event, which is the fall of this city here, a city called Megiddo. And in 722 BC, and this is in northern Israel, the city of Megiddo, this is now being excavated, was destroyed by King Sargon, the Assyrian, and its population was expelled. In fact, they became the seven lost tribes of Israel. That's what the seven lost tribes of Israel myth comes from. And they generated the idea that at the end of time, which in their view would probably be quite soon, they and their descendants, all the way through to the end of time, would all gather together on the plain of Armageddon, which is what it's called, ready for the second coming, or whatever event might take place when the world comes to an end. Well, you can work out how many people might be there. Now, we all know that we have two parents, four grandparents, eight great-grandparents, and so on. And if you start multiplying that number up, in other words, if we are all entirely unrelated to each other, you come very quickly to a pretty big sum. It's something like 47 to 50 human generations back to 722 BC, the literal fall of Megiddo. So how many people would have lived had we been entirely outbred, in other words, not related to each other, since then? Well, we go up 2, 4, 8, 16, 2 to the 47th, which is it's a big number. I think it's 10 with 48 zeros after it. But the real number is actually about worldwide was not more than 100 million. I see a couple of zeros have dropped off there, but we don't care. Rounding errors, as we call them. So clearly, we have to share ancestors with everybody else, because there will be no room for us all our families to be independent to each other. And the question arises, what does that mean? What will happen? Well, you can illustrate what will happen by making pedigrees. And of course, genetics is, or was, the study of pedigrees. Many have been made. One of the neat ways of seeing what will happen is to look at one particular chromosome, which of course was the chromosome which was most important to the people of Megiddo, which is the Y chromosome, the chromosome that makes males male and is passed, a bit like a surname, from father to son to grandson, at least in the Western tradition. And let's say this was... let's imagine that we have a population of 22 individuals, okay, living today, and previously the village which we're talking about could support 22 individuals, but just by chance, 1, 2, 3, 4 men had no sons, okay? Some of the others had 2 to make up for it. So the previous generation, a couple more men had more sons, no sons, so their Y chromosomes disappeared from the story. And as we go through, really quite quickly we get to the state where everybody alive today descends from one individual who we could, if we like, call Adam. And we can do that not just for the Y chromosome, we can do it for the mitochondrial line, which is the female lineage. Indeed, we can do it for any length of DNA, any length of genes, and we can begin to work out when the ancestors of ourselves, our partners, other members of our family, our nation, our continent, our world, when they actually may have lived. Well, as I say, on the average, 2 Britons are about 6 cousins. So their shared ancestors lived in around 1859. Now that rings a bell, or a dreidel, as the case may be. The 1859, of course, was the year in which The Origin of Species was published. And I often say from down here, when I'm talking about evolution, increasingly now I have to say, I'm speaking to you from Darwin's bunker. And of course, literally that's true. This was Charles Darwin's coal bunker down here when he moved into Gower Street, after they'd thrown out the 2 dead dogs in the back garden, so not much has changed. This is Darwin's bunker, literally and metaphorically, okay, because we have to defend evolution now against the world of the stupid, but I don't propose to do that now. So our joint ancestor lived at the time of Charles Darwin. Some of them may indeed have known Charles Darwin. There he is. I thought I'd show you one of these because you're not going to see one of these for a long time, I can tell you, in this business. And a £10 note, and there's Charles looking like the great sage that he actually was, and of course a man of quite astonishing ability. Now, Charles Darwin is famous for having written The Origin, but of course he wrote many other books. In fact, he wrote, I think, 19 volumes altogether on things like barnacles, climbing plants, earthworms, and famously on inbreeding and outbreeding, selfing and outcrossing in plants. Why did he write what is, I have to tell you, a very boring book about selfing and outcrossing in plants? It came from his own concern about his own marriage. Darwin married his cousin Emma, and therefore they had grandparents in common. As you can see from this pedigree, there's Charles and Emma at the bottom, with a shared ancestor of Josiah Wedgwood. Darwin was very concerned about what damage that might do to the health of his family. And he got that idea from another great figure associated with UCL, Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin in another direction, who was convinced that inbreeding, the marriage of relatives, would cause genetic damage. And Darwin wrote thousands, 14,000 letters, and in one of them he wrote, when we hear it said that a man carries in his constitution the seeds of an inherited disease, there is much literal truth in the expression. And he even described his own family as in some way polluted because of the extent of what he thought was inherited disease among them. Well, there's Charles and Emma. In the end, in fact, their marriage was happy. They had 10 children, most of whom survived. And when Emma was in her late 40s, he wrote, Emma has been, in her early 40s, Emma has been very neglectful of late, for we have not had a child for more than 1 whole year. So clearly in his case, perhaps the effect wasn't that striking. However, many people believe that to marry a cousin is very dangerous. You'd be surprised to learn, I was surprised to learn, that cousin marriage is actually a criminal offence in 8 states of the United States, and in 22 more states is at least illegal, although actually that's widely ignored nowadays. So why should it have an effect on health? What's the logic for saying it has an effect on health? I think in Darwin's time, to a degree, that came from observation of inbred animals. We'll come back to that in a second. But also the concern that certain families certainly had become extremely inbred and had all kinds of damage caused as a result. Certainly, intense inbreeding damages the health of individuals or creatures that do it, and that's because every animal, every plant out there has a large amount of hidden genetic diversity scattered across the whole genome, which are what we call recessive alleles. In other words, if you have only one copy of these variants, they're pretty harmless, but if you have two copies of the same one, then you may suffer really quite severely. And we've all heard of things like cystic fibrosis and so on, where about one person in 25 in this room will have one copy of the cystic fibrosis gene without knowing anything about it. One baby in 2,500 is born with two, and that's really quite a damaging thing to happen. There's more of that around than you might imagine. If I was to pick up my Mendelian magic wand and wave it over the assembled multitude and make every one of you have two copies of those single copy hidden variants, everybody in this room would die about 2.5 times. Okay? So each one of us has more than two copies on the average of genes in single copy, which if they were present in double copy, then they would be lethal, and many more that would be harmful. And that's well established, and you're much more likely to have a particular gene in double copy, of course, if you share a recent common ancestor with your partner. If you share a grandparent, for example, you married your cousin, then if that grandparent had a copy hidden away of a damaged gene, it's much more likely than average that that copy has come down those two bits of the pedigree and joined together in you. Well, certainly there are severe effects on health in some cases. Darwin talked a lot about the effects on flowers. That's actually rather interesting. That's what Darwin's genius. That's what Darwin did. Darwin invented the science of biology. He was worried about the health of his own children. So what did he do? He did experiments on flowers because he had come up with laws, evolutionary laws, which applied across the whole of the living world. So you could take data from plants and apply them to animals and to humans. And it's worth reflecting for a moment what an astonishing insight that actually was. People really had never thought like that before. Darwin did a lot of work on flowers, and he showed that actually close inbreeding in hermaphrodite flowers was usually damaging. So the flower which was simultaneously male and female, and there are many of them, which prefers normally to attract, as is actually mandatory when you're giving a lecture on this subject, from a flower's point of view, a bee is a flying penis, so they have to attract the flying penis, take the pollen from one flower to another flower and bring pollen into it. They won't accept normally their own pollen. Darwin circumvented that in a rather Clyde Bell kind of way. He invented a sort of botanical condom which he slid over his flowers, and he used a paintbrush rather than a bee in order almost to force the plants to self-fertilize. And he found generally quite a severe effect of close inbreeding, really close inbreeding, what Woody Allen calls sex with somebody you really love, in other words, yourself. Most of these plants had paid a high price for that effect. And he was very worried about that. And he also looked at other creatures. He was very interested in dogs. And dogs are actually a classic example of close inbreeding. Here's the bulldog, handsome-looking animal. During Darwin's own lifetime, he was 8 when that was painted, and the bulldogs were trained to attack bulls, to bite their faces, actually. They got this snub nose so they can hold onto the bull's face. This is the winner of the Bulldog at Crufts in 2008, and that animal is extremely inbred. It's inbred because the breeders have applied astonishingly strict and arbitrary rules to what the breed standard should be. So in other words, if a bulldog is going to get more marks for having a protuberant lower jaw, the more protuberant it is, the more they'll breed from it, the fewer there will be to breed from, and the more inbred the creatures will become, until in the end they pay an enormous price. The figures are pretty impressive. There are 300,000 golden retrievers in Britain. If you trace them back for just 30 years, they all descend from 7,000 animals. If you look at pugs, those repellent little creatures, they're so inbred. There are 10,000 of them in Britain, and they share recent ancestry with only 50 animals. And in fact, the pugs are a classic case because the pugs carried a gene for what's called exophthalmia, your eyes popping out a bit. The breed standard is that your eyes should be bright and startling and gazing out of your head. And so one of the joys of being a pug owner is that you constantly have to lick your thumb and push the poor animal's eye back into its socket. And you may have seen a couple of years ago a program about inbreeding in dogs, which is really quite shocking, and which caused the BBC to pull out of supporting the Crufts dog show, which I think was a very good thing. So recently the dog genome has been sequenced, and Darwin talked a lot about how similar breed the dogs were and how different they were between breeds. Most surprising, really, is how similar we are across the world. Most human diversity is between two individuals, two English people or two Chinese or two Nigerians. There's rather little diversity across the world. There is some. Dogs are entirely different. You can partition the genetic variation, the totality of dog variation across all breeds, into, using this rather complicated program called structure, into particular types which come out different colors, and you can see the particular breeds really are very closely related to each other, and the breeds are very, very different. Just look at the bottom line there. So dogs are very, very inbred, and they paid the price. So how are we going to measure inbreeding in humans? Well, there are various ways in which you can do it. Certainly there's been a lot of it about, historically. The guy who came up with a way of measuring human inbreeding was once again Francis Galton. Again, a genius, a flawed genius compared to Darwin. Galton who was rich, like all biologists then and now. Galton, who was genuinely rich. Darwin was rich. He was worth about £17 million in modern terms when he died. He could even have been in the cabinet. Galton had the habit of going on walking holidays in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. And in those days, that was a remote and little-known part of the world. Galton was interested in human quality. He wanted to know, were there better and worse people around? How could you measure it? He was the only person famously to have made a beauty map of the British Isles, and we've still got the little brass counting device he used to walk through British cities, clicking it and scoring the local females on a 5-point scale from attractive to repulsive. The low point was in Aberdeen. I gave this lecture once in Aberdeen and had to make hightails for the railway station, I can tell you. Because I said, of course, where it still is, which is, of course, not true. But Darwin was interested in quality. Galton was interested in quality. And he turned up in one of these remote Italian villages and noticed something strange. And prepare yourself, you may have heard this joke before, it's pathetically awful. He noticed that everybody in that village had the same second name, the same surname. It might perhaps have been Spaghetti. I told you it was a weak joke. So we noted that without much concern, he moved on to the next village, 15 miles away across the mountains, isolated, remote. Noticed that everybody had the same name, but it was a different name, Pasta. Next village, cannelloni, and so on and so on. And this immediately struck him as perhaps this was due to, for some reason, it was advantageous to have the spaghetti genes, as we might say today, in village 1 and the cannelloni genes in village 2. People were a different quality. So he thought about that, but then he realized it wasn't like that at all. It actually arose from the inevitable inbreeding that takes place in small populations. If you go into the records of these villages and you look at the surnames, okay, it turns out that every village 500 years ago effectively had 10 different surnames. Pasta, cannelloni, if you can think of 9 more, good luck to you. And every village had a number of surnames, but every generation, as we saw in that simulation of a pedigree, every generation, perhaps one man or two men had no sons. So their surname disappeared, okay? And other surnames and other genes became more common. Perhaps they had only daughters or they had no children at all. And soon, everybody began to share the same surname, just by random chance. They shared exactly the same Y chromosome, which passes down the male line, but they also shared an increasing proportion of all their other genes as well. So that if one looked within that village, you would find everybody who married within that village was actually marrying somebody who's pretty closely related to them. So you can measure inbreeding crudely by counting the ratio between the number of surnames and the number of people in a particular village. Now, we can do it in other ways in some places because we actually have pedigrees, and there are some famous pedigrees that show extreme inbreeding. The pharaohs really went into it. Akhenaton, who lived around 1300 BC, married his cousin Nefertiti, then a second wife, then 3 of his daughters by Nefertiti, and then his own mother. Okay? That's going a bit over the top. Now, the pharaohs were, of course, a regal dynasty, a royal dynasty that lasted, or several dynasties, that lasted many hundreds or over 1,000 years. We, fortunately, have the equivalent here in Europe of royal families. And take it from me, nowadays they are to genetics what fruit flies used to be. We really need data from royal families because they keep pedigrees. And we know an awful lot about royal family genetics, but I'll just talk a little bit about it. And there's a lot of inbreeding. Let's imagine we do this sum, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. If you go back for 6 generations, 6 cousin time, roughly speaking, you should have 64 ancestors, okay? That's what you should have if you're not related. Here are some random royals. There's, look at Alfonso XII, the King of Spain. He only had 6. So it's a cousin after cousin after cousin, uncle, niece marriages. Other ones, Mary Antonia of Austria, she only had 6. Louis XV had 12. So there was extreme inbreeding. And you can see that in a pedigree by looking at the ancestry. And of course the ancestry is carefully recorded. And what happens in an inbreeding pedigree, there are loops in it. Rather than having the branching out like a pied de grue, a crane's foot, which is what the word pedigree comes from, with lots of independent branches sprouting out from a single base, yourself, you have these loops. And of course, there are many, many loops, and every time there's a loop, there's a bit more inbreeding. And so if there's inbreeding every generation, then it builds up with time, and you end up, perhaps, with various problems. Certainly, the Spanish royal family was pretty unusual. Philip V was described as unbalanced. Ferdinand IV was over-sensual. Isabel II was a nymphomaniac. And Alfonso XII was tubercular, because tuberculosis was then thought to be an inherited disease. And they certainly did pay some cost for that. Interestingly, Alfonso married the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, who unfortunately herself carried a single copy of the famous blood clotting disorder haemophilia, and brought that into the Spanish royal family. So his attempt to improve their bloodline actually went somewhat wrong. Okay, so that's what you can do with, you can measure inbreeding in many ways, through ancestry, through names, and as we will see, in other ways too. Does it have any effect on human health? Darwin, as I say, step back one, I missed the slide. You might say, what do you expect from the Bourbons, the Spanish royal family? You know, we all know what they're like, nymphomaniac, sensual, all that kind of stuff. What about our own royal family? Well, you might say they're a perfect exemplar of human normality, possibly. But that's not true. Here's the Edward the Confessor at the top, Charles and Di in the middle, and one of their sons at the bottom. Now, both Charles can trace his descent from Edward the Confessor through 3,000 different pathways, many, many loops, because he's royal. Actually, in truth, Di was probably more regal because she can trace her descent from the same bloke through 4,000 different lines of descent with many, many loops. And inevitably then, their son is going to have 2 copies of particular examples of Edward the Confessor's genes by virtue of his shared ancestry. So it's everywhere, even in the British royal family. So the question then arises: how are we going to measure this? One way, which actually Darwin was very interested in how we do this, and he wanted to put it. He wanted to measure the effects on health, and he wanted to put a question into the 1851 census. Asking whether people were married to their cousins, okay? And the House of Commons wouldn't let him do it, and I think probably quite rightly, Darwin was furious. But the reason they wouldn't let him do it, of course, was that Queen Victoria herself had married her cousin, and they didn't really want to embarrass her. So they didn't get that, but his son George Darwin, who was also pretty smart, had a very bright idea. He started looking at particular groups and asking within a particular group, can we separate them into an inbred and an outbred group and see if there are any difference between them? And he looked first of all at the boat race crews of Oxford and Cambridge colleges. And he found, in fact, quite a strong effect. It was a bit marred by the fact that Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, lied about who their crew were, but that's another story. It was still true that the number of offspring of cousin marriages within the boat race crews, you know, those sort of rugger-bugger types, big, healthy people, was considerably less than the number of offspring of cousin marriages among the nerds, the sort of weedy types like me who spent all their time in the library. And he actually thought, okay, well, maybe this is evidence for a health effect, but it really was a rather weak one, and it was actually a very small sample. So George had the brilliant idea, it is a brilliant idea, of going back to Galton's notion and realizing that actually a very effective way of generating huge amounts of data on cousin marriages, on marriage of relatives, is to ask how often do two people with the same surname, the same second name, get married? And if that's a rare name, like Darwin or Wedgwood, if you're a Darwin and you marry somebody else who is called Darwin, it's highly likely that they actually spring from the same family as you do. And that technique is called isonymy, I-S-O-N-Y-M-Y. And of course, all you need to do it, and I can see this becoming increasingly popular in the near future, is a telephone book or the census records, and you can work out the extent of the marriage record. You can get huge amounts of data, and huge amounts of data have indeed been gathered. Now we can do more because we actually know that his idea that shared names and shared genes go together was dead right. In fact, it's probably more right than he realized. As I said, names and the Y chromosome, surnames and the Y chromosome, tend to go down the generations together. So that in principle, if you're a Darwin, say, and you marry somebody called Darwin you don't know, if this works, or two male Darwins who don't know each other, should therefore have the same Y chromosome set of variants. And the Y chromosome has got variant size scattered along it. It's literally a genetical surname. It just passes from fathers to sons. And it's got all these variants we can read off as you read off the Y. And it turns out the effect is strikingly true. Here we have a bunch, cohort 1 is a bunch of males of a particular surname, most of them rare surnames. And cohort 2 is a second bunch of males with the same set of rare surnames. And what the people who did this in Leicester did was rather clever. They took cohort 1, or 10 or so different names, Revis was one of them, I remember. They took cohort 1 and they just went to the phone book, see if they could find somebody else with the same name in a distant city, asked them whether they'd give DNA, and they did. And lo and behold, there was quite an extraordinary overlap between the name and the genetic constitution. So much so that there now have been arrests made by getting data on surnames, finding a blood smear, let's say, at the scene of a crime, and working out what the probable surname of that criminal might have been, because he might have a DNA constitution which was similar to somebody else of a particular surname. And that's actually been successful in more than one case. So it's got some rather scary implications of it. Okay, well, what does that do about patterns of inbreeding? One clear truth is that if you look at the different nations of the British Isles, and now of course there are 5 of them altogether, apparently. I was in another one, Scotland, yesterday, and I'm in yet another one, Northern Ireland, next week. It's clear that we can establish with a reasonable guess from surnames where people come from. My name Jones, of course, which is dirt common, and has appeared many, many times, and it's not because of that isn't much good at measuring inbreeding, is a Welsh name. MacDonald is a Scottish name. O'Connell is an Irish name. And within those particular populations, not the Welsh, apart from the Morgans who are a bit snotty, but the rest of us, are, the Powells are even worse actually. The rest of us accept that we have recent names that don't say very much. But people with particular names, let's say Campbell or MacDonald or O'Connell, are very proud of this fact and often try to trace their ancestry back to some mythic figure. And you can measure from the phone book in Ireland, it's been widely done, how much isonomy is there, how often does an O'Connell marry an O'Connell, and the answer is quite frequently. Well, there is a group of surnames in Ireland which the families persuade themselves that they descend from one 5th century hostage taker called Neil of the 9 Hostages, who was a warlord in much the sense as Bin Laden was a warlord, and carried out all kinds of mayhem. And people sort of smiled politely at this idea and didn't think much of it, until about 5 years ago somebody went out and started mapping the Y chromosomes of Ireland, and it turned out that those families did share a particular Y chromosome, and that Y chromosome, there's Neil of the 9 hostages on the left, that Y chromosome, quite unlike the normal patterns of Y chromosomes, most of which are rare, they aren't very common ones, reaches a frequency of about 1 in 6 at the centre of Neil's kingdom in Donegal. And many, many matings within that population as a result have been matings between relatives, because they descend not only from Neil but from his ancestors and from many other groups too. So that's fine, okay. Well, what can we discern from names, first of all, before we go on to genes, about the patterns of inbreeding, not just in the aristocrats of Ireland, but in the population of Britain. You probably don't know this, but you may know that. There's a group here at UCL which is famous for its work on surnames, on its spatial patterning, the way they vary from place to place. And they could be used much more than they are to study genetics. Here's a weird-looking diagram. It's not the obesity map of Britain, so it doesn't, which has actually got a big bulge near Glasgow and near Cardiff. That's the reason for the reason for the shape of that map is simply because it shows distribution of British population. But what we want to look at in more detail, is the surname diversity. And you'll see it goes from blue, where there's almost no surname diversity, to red, where almost everybody within a particular town or village has a different surname. And you can see in Wales, my native land, very high, very low surname diversity, but that's only because names like Jones, Evans, Price, and so on, they only come from the 18th or the 17th century when they were forced on us by the evil English invaders. But if you look in somewhere like London or Manchester or Liverpool, you will see enormous surname diversity, simply because there are people from all over the world who brought their names and their genes to those cities, and so that and if you look in Scotland, for example, some places there's diversity, but I'll come back to this at the end. But if you look at the Western Isles and the Northern Isles, at Orkney and the far north in particular, you'll see a very low diversity of surnames. So there are quite big differences in the probable degrees of inbreeding, of marrying relatives, even across the British Isles. And they're much bigger than that across the world as a whole. Where are we? So what happens if you marry? What is the picture worldwide? Well, as I say, this is what happens. This is the genetic effects of mating with a relative. And what happens is, if you mate with a close relative, the chances of you passing on two copies of the same gene are very high. Father-daughter mating or brother-sister mating, which does happen, although it's rare, it's very high. A cousin marriage, or a double cousin marriage, is about a 0.06 chance, or 1/16 chance of passing on two copies of the same gene. There are closer marriage patterns. Uncle-niece, where you marry your brother's daughter, common in some parts of the Middle East. Double first cousin, where both sides of the family have shared grandparents. It's also closer. But as you begin to move away to second, third, and fourth cousin, the effects get small. Okay? So we're really only concerned with consanguineous marriages, as they're called, of uncle-niece, double first cousin, and beyond that, the effect is pretty minor. And you can look at the figures across the world. What proportion of all marriages are consanguineous to a different consanguineous up to the level of cousin marriage? And there are some figures that are actually quite high. There's a high proportion in various parts of the world of marriages. 200 million marriages where the degree of consanguinity averaged over the generations is 50%, and that's a lot. So there are hundreds of millions of people across the world who are married to close relatives. Okay, and if you draw a map of that, it's clear that it's concentrated in particular regions of the world. It's concentrated to a degree in the Middle East, among Islamic populations there. The Prophet himself says nothing about this, but it grew up as a tradition within Islam. It's common in South India, it's common in Iran, it's common in parts of West Africa. The second most inbred population in the world are the Kashgai people of Iran, in which the incidence of cousin marriage is 3 in 4. Okay, so there's a lot of it around, an enormous amount, and it's not rare. And in fact, if anything, it's getting commoner. Possibly the most inbred population in the world is the Pakistani population of Bradford in the north of England, where the incidence of cousin marriage at least 10 years ago was extraordinarily high, in part because they tended to marry their cousins left back behind in Pakistan. And there's been a survey of the health effects of cousin marriage among that group, and you can see it's really quite striking. Here we have various problems at birth of North European in general populations and the British Pakistani populations, and you can see that for all kinds of conditions, particularly disability at birth, difficulty in walking and so on, early death, to a lesser degree congenital malformation, cousin marriage the people of Brantford pay a high price for cousin marriages. You basically double mortality and morbidity if you marry your cousin. So the effect isn't small. It's small in numerical sense because, of course, the incidence now of infant neonatal death is very small. It's 1% or so. But even doubling that is noticeable. And, of course, for the families involved, it's tragic. If you go back to the Mormons, who are not a particularly inbred group, but have a very, very excellent set of pedigrees, all the way back from the early days of Mormonism, the figures were the same there. The death rate of their children, as they moved into Utah, was about 25% for unrelated parents, but for related parents it was 50%. So it seems to double, roughly speaking, doubles mortality and morbidity. So the effect is really quite noticeable. Okay, so people are naturally interested in the effect. How are we going to find out more? Well, you can find out more by looking at genes. And there's now a huge interest here at UCL and elsewhere in doing that, of making what's called the human genome diversity map. The patterns of variation of all the peoples across the world. And you find all kinds of interesting things to do with genes for skin color, genes for ability to drink milk and all that kind of stuff. But from our point of view, this process has shown that we have ourselves been, some of us have been through a long history of close inbreeding. This is the world colonization route, we know, given that we emerged as a species, Homo sapiens, in East Africa, you can work out what the probable track of colonization was across the world. Obviously, we didn't swim the Pacific to get to the New World. We walked there by going around to Siberia and crossing the Bering Land Bridge, and we didn't climb over the Himalayas. We went round them. So you can make this map, and you can make a map of how far any population you sample is on this map from Addis Ababa. And what you find is actually a remarkably impressive decrease in variation, heterozygosity as I would say, as you move away from the human birthplace, which is Addis Ababa. Okay? So much so that the degree of variation in populations at the southern tip of the Americas is a good, it's not quite half that of African populations, but it's small. Why should that be? It comes from repeated episodes of living in small inbred groups. We know, I guess everybody knows, I have to say I was the first person to work it out, but nobody ever acknowledges me for this fact. Everybody knows that we went through a population bottleneck of some small number as we left Africa, but the genes tell us that actually happened again and again. In fact, we know LD stands for linkage disequilibrium, which is jargon, but what LD linkage disequilibrium means, it refers to the lengths of chromosome which have variation stuck along them and don't reshuffle during sex as genes on separate chromosomes would do. And a short block of chromosome almost never reshuffles during sex. Longer blocks reshuffle more, and longer blocks reshuffle more and more again. But if you've moved away from sex, and by that I mean if you've mated with a cousin, you've mated with somebody who shares the same block of genes, that's less likely to happen because you won't see the reshuffling and you'll generate these long genetic surnames, long stretches of double doses of invariant lengths of chromosome. You can see that there were indeed big bottlenecks when we went into the Middle East, when we went into Asia and the Americas, and some very striking ones indeed as we went, for example, into places like Hawaii. And if you go to Hawaii, if you go to the islands out there, you'll see that people actually look remarkably similar. I think we have 5 minutes. Yeah, you had me worried there for a moment. So you can infer what the patterns of inbreeding must be by looking at these, not just surnames, but at the genetical surnames going down the generations. And that's now been, very recently, that's been done in various unexpected places. First of all, on some islands in Croatia, which we know to be extraordinarily inbred from pedigrees, which go back for hundreds of years, okay? And what they did was to go out and find some Croats and grind them up and look at their DNA and ask how often did they have 2 long runs of the same sets of genes. And this is kind of a complicated diagram. Just look at the right-hand diagram there, okay? Oh, bugger, all right, look to the second left. Yeah, so it's some setting on my computer. I knew there'd be something go wrong with this damn thing. Always happens. Okay, these are lengths, what's called runs of homozygosity. And a run of homozygosity is a double dose of one particular length of DNA across your chromosomes, okay? And if you have a double dose of one particular long length of DNA, that probably means you had a recent shared ancestor. Now, we've all got double doses of short lengths of DNA, but as you pick out longer and longer lengths, you'll see that becomes rarer and rarer. Now, it turns out that endogamous Dalmatians, and they are dogs, they're Croats, these are the people who live on the islands, they have lots and lots of those double doses of long lengths of DNA, double surnames, as it were. Mixed Dalmatians, which are Dalmatians who marry somebody from another island, they have a bit less. Remarkably, people from the Orkneys, the second one here, have almost as many as the people from those remote Croatian islands. So actually the genes are telling us, somewhat to everybody's surprise, because the history of the Orkneys suggests this, it doesn't suggest this is true, that the Orkneys, who have their own set of surnames, of course, and very little variation in surname, the people of the Orkneys are indeed remarkably inbred, much more so than the people of Scotland in general, and if you go into Europe as a whole, there's nobody in Europe as a whole who has these long, long lengths. So we have local patches of inbreeding in Britain. And this is causing a great deal of interest because it turns out that all kinds of illnesses, dear me, all kinds of illnesses emerge from this. For example, if you have lots of double doses of the same genetic surname, a long run of heterozygosity, as we call it, you're much more likely to suffer from cancer than people who don't have those double doses. So if you're inbred, you'll see, this is colon cancer patients at the top, group A, you'll see lots and lots of double doses of these things. If you're outbred, you'll see fewer double doses of these long lengths of DNA. So there's a great deal of interest there. And the interest, and I will end up in a moment, the interest turns on, okay, everything we know, or so it seems, about inbreeding seems to be not a very good thing. So why do we not give it up altogether? And why does sex specific... Everything we know about inbreeding seems to be not a very good thing. There are plenty of creatures that do it. Why do they do it? And why do we and most other creatures have sex and have actually quite strong taboos against close inbreeding? Well, to go back to Darwin's logic, we can look at it in a different creature. Some work of my own, now they're rather old. This is a slug, Arion ater. Beautiful, charming animals, as I'm sure you know. You pick them up just at dawn, best of all. They're about the same size as a dog dropping, so you have to be rather careful. And what's interesting, if you were to go out into your gardens here and look at your slugs, you would find that they vary quite strikingly from animal to animal. They're diverse and variable. And slugs are hermaphrodite, okay? They're like these plants. They're those animals which are both male and female. If you were to go to the north of England, and look at those slugs, you'd find they were all black. Now, why is that? Well, as I say, slugs are hermaphrodite, and they're open to the temptation, and they can do it if they need to, of mating with themselves, rather than going through this messy business. Oh my God, I could make your hair stand on end by describing what they get up to, of finding another slug, and boy-girl meets girl-boy, and take it from me, under those circumstances, you want to be the boy, not the girl. So they fight each other and club each other with their penises, and God knows what they get up to. But basically, it's ordinary sex, all right? So there's plenty of recombination. There's not much inbreeding. However, if you do it to yourself, very quickly, you end up in a situation where all the creatures look the same. And they don't just look the same, their genes are the same. And this is a very ancient piece of work of mine, ancient technology. Here are some slugs populations from Oxfordshire. These are DNA, very old-fashioned DNA gels. And you can see every animal looks different. On the right here, there are some slug populations from the Isle of Skye, where they're all the same because they've all given up sex. From a slug's point of view, sex stops at Preston as you go north, okay? Why should that be? Well, this is a very general pattern in plants and in animals, and the general theory has been that actually it has to do with resistance to disease. If your enemies are physical enemies, which are always the same, as in Preston, say, or Scotland, cold, starvation, despair, that kind of stuff, then it pays you, in inverted commas, to generate a genotype, a set of genes, which can deal with that predictable annual return of these difficulties. If, on the other hand, your enemies are other creatures, parasites, bacteria, diseases, which are themselves sexual, you can't do that. because your enemies are changing all the time. They're reshuffling their genetic cards. And so you have to keep up with them. So sex becomes, it's like the Red Queen, famously. Everybody has to run to keep up. And that's a general phenomenon of which we know a huge amount in plants and animals, and Darwin knew about. It's just turned out, in fact, the same is true in humans. If you look at the inbreeding rates, measured in a rather odd way here, of various groups, the more inbred you are, the more likely you are to have blood poisoning, meningitis, neonatal sepsis, even malaria. So it does seem to be an effect there. So inbreeding seems to be a bad thing. We're stuck with sex, okay? And the good news, the final take-home message, is that the world is getting sexier in the sense that there's less, at least Britain's getting sexier, there's less inbreeding than there ever was. I want to show you that. Let's look at these surnames again. Okay, here's my family name in 1881. As you can see, that's where I come from. There's a very high incidence of that name and probably a reasonable level incidence of inbreeding in the 1880s. If you go to 1998, by 1998 we'd almost made it to Cambridge, okay? You have to be at a frequency of more than 5%, I think, to make it onto this map. But you can see the Jones genes are smearing themselves across the map of Britain, as indeed the genes of everybody else and of people across the world. And Britain is an astonishingly sexually open society. You can see that quite strikingly in London. Half the children in London who have got one Afro-Caribbean parent, the other parent is white. Okay? And in fact, skin colour in London is only the 5th most important determinant of who you're going to marry. The most important determinant in London and elsewhere is educational level. That's why you all come to UCL, no doubt. But skin colour is down there. So we're rapidly becoming much, much more open in our DNA. You can ask yourselves the following question. How far away was your birthplace from that of your partner, if you have one, compared to your parents' birthplace, and so on? And you'll almost inevitably see that that number is going up with time. My parents, as it happened, my wife and I, and she's an American, she's actually on her way to Moscow at the moment, unfortunately. My wife and I were separated by 3,000 miles, my parents by 3 miles, and as a student once pointed out, you can tell. And that's a general phenomenon. So I think we've lived through the history of human inbreeding. It's rapidly coming to an end. And finally, and at last, the whole human race is becoming one coalition, a great triumph of the average. So I'll stop there. Thank you.